literally, the French word manger, spelled exactly the same way, is the verb to eat. And really also to chew continuously. So here God was serving up his son, and this is almost too graphic. He's serving him up as something to be eaten. I'm very visual, so maybe it's not the same for you, but to me there's a striking similarity between a fresh-baked little roll of white bread in a napkin to keep it warm in a basket, and this freshly born baby in swaddling clothes in a manger. But maybe it's just me, maybe others also missed it, but I don't think the shepherds missed it. Because they came running to that manger like hungry teenagers after a dinner bell. They came on a double, and maybe it was because they were hungry in more ways than one and not used to a buffet, and they were able to appreciate what they were invited to witness, and they worshipped. But actually, everybody should have had a clue that this was what God was doing, because that's what the prophets foretold. They said, Micah by name said that he was going to be born in Bethlehem. Bet meaning house, and lechem meaning bread. He was going to come from the house of bread. There's a clue. That's pretty clear. And God wanted it to be so. He wanted people to understand that here was bread to be eaten, but they missed it. And besides the shepherds, we don't know that anybody else really caught on for a long time. Because by the time the wise men arrived, Jesus was almost 2 years old, still in the house of bread, still in Bethlehem. And they arrived with these interesting gifts. And I know a lot has been said about the gold being, a gift of kings, and the myrrh and the frankincense being used in healing, and maybe the myrrh even being prophetic of Jesus' death. So there's all of that. But I just wanted, I hoped as I was preparing this message that those symbols had something more to them, that there was something more significant about the combination of these three gifts that they brought, and the manger, the bread. So I started looking for places in Scripture where these elements were present, and I found it in the temple, in a place of meeting, just outside the curtain, behind which God's glory was hidden. And here in front of the curtain, God had commanded Moses and Aaron and the priests to set up what was called the bread of presence, or the showbread. And these were 12 loaves of bread stacked in 2 rows of 6. There are all sorts of interesting descriptions in the writings of the rabbis on how this was done. They were each about 13.5 pounds. So these are not little buns. They're huge breads. And they were made from the flour that the 12 tribes contributed. And they were baked very carefully, not to be burned on one side and raw on the other like everything I bake. It was very, very well done, carefully. And they were kept intact, and they were replaced every Sabbath so that they always would be fresh. And they represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And they represented the best we could bring to God. But of course, it's never worthy of a holy God. And so the instruction was that frankincense had to be placed on top of these breads and burned before God continuously. This bread also, literally, the name of this bread is the bread of faces. So here were the faces of God's people before him, and God faced them from behind the curtain. And here we have these wise men, and how could they have known? Well, there actually is a chance they could have known what they were doing, and that it was no coincidence. Many scholars believe that these wise men were of the same grouping that Daniel was a member of when he served under Nebuchadnezzar and also Darius. When the Babylonians were replaced by the Medes and the Persians, he served as a magi, as a wise man, as a mage or whatever. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. And he was regarded as one of the greatest. And it's very likely that people coming after him in those courts were trained in his stories and his wisdom, and that they had access to the book of Daniel like we do. And in the book of Daniel, we read right in chapter 1 how he mourns and very passionately tells the story of how God's temple was raided and how all of the holy vessels were taken. And then later we learn how Nebuchadnezzar uses these in a profane way in his festivals to desecrate further what was holy to God. So we can imagine that he may have described this place in a temple where a wooden table was covered with gold, and where the breads were placed and with frankincense on top, and where myrrh was mixed into the olive oil in the lampstands that burned before God forever. The only thing they didn't bring, these wise men, to the manger was the bread. And this time, God has brought the bread. And he has laid the bread in that manger. And now his glory is no longer behind the veil. Because Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 6 that Jesus is the face of God's glory. And in Hebrews 1:3 it says the radiance of God's glory. So here the glory of God in the face of Christ is meeting man. For the first time, not behind the veil anymore. For the first time, really making contact with our world. And I think the wise men got it because, like the shepherds, they worshipped. They didn't miss this miracle. But many missed it afterwards. And Jesus came to a place, and we read this in John 6, where he had to really explain it. He demonstrated it with this impressive miracle where he fed 5,000 people with a lot left over, and still they didn't get it. Still they confronted him and said, so what sign are you going to give us? You know, our forefathers got manna from heaven, so what are you going to do? And Jesus tried to explain to them that they were just after free food, but that what he was intending to give them was eternal bread, living bread. And he then says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger, and who believes in me will never thirst. And here, he probably triggered a little bit of a reminder of the prophecies again, because they knew that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. So him reminding them that his bread from the house of bread is a strategy, I think. But even the water was very significant in the context of Bethlehem, because what had happened just 200 years earlier, and what they would have been very acutely aware of, is that all of those sacrifices brought at Jerusalem at the temple, all of that blood that seeped into the soil, had contaminated the underground water sources of Jerusalem to such an extent that the drinking water was no longer fit for human use. There's a picture here for us. The old covenant had put so much death in Jerusalem that water had to be brought from Bethlehem. Bethlehem was about 100 foot higher up than Jerusalem, and it was a basin, a fertile place, and they had built a reservoir there 200 years earlier, and later 3 more, the pools of Solomon, and water had to be channeled from there to Jerusalem because so many pilgrims came there for sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. Repetitive, dead religion that put death in the water. And here is Jesus, and he's saying, I want to give you the kind of water that is so full of life that you will never thirst. And if that wasn't offensive enough, he said to them, if you don't eat me and if you don't drink me, you can have no part in me. And that made a lot of people leave. Jesus uses 2 verbs here. He says, those who come to me will never hunger. and those who believe in me will never thirst. And these are the two calls of Christmas. It says, come, not just come all you faithful, but even come those of you who don't know whether you want to commit yet. There's an open invitation. Just please come. But it's kind of hard to come. Because you have to stop sometimes, turn 180 and go the opposite direction to get to Jesus. Or you have to interrupt your plans and what you really want to be doing and pause. And sometimes Jesus is a distraction. He's out of your way. It's a good thing those shepherds had nothing better to do than sit in the field. Maybe that's why they could come. Very little else that competed with the call to come. I love Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a wonderful theologian, and he said something about how hard it is to come to the manger, and maybe especially for us, because you have to come hungry, and we are not. We are not just well-fed, we are perhaps overfed, in not just with food, but with everything. He says, for the great and powerful of this world, there are only two places in which their courage fails them, of which they are afraid deep down in their souls, from which they shy away. These are the manger and the cross of Jesus Christ. No powerful person dares to approach the manger, and this even includes King Herod, for this is where thrones shake. The mighty fall, the prominent perish, because God is with the lowly. Here the rich come to nothing, because God is with the poor and hungry. But the rich and satisfied he sends away empty. Before Mary the maid, before the manger of Christ, before God in lowliness, the powerful come to naught. But maybe we are able to at least come. Maybe we're able to come. But then we also have to believe. And in the context of the manger, believing means eating. Believing means really taking a hold of Christ and making him our own. And the Pharisees will always show up to tell you you are not on the guest list. They will always tell you what they told Jesus and his disciples. You didn't wash your hands. Oh no, it's a Sabbath. You cannot pluck wheat on a Sabbath. It's not a good time to eat right now. Or they will say, you know what the really religious thing is? To actually fast. There will always be the voices that keeps you from eating this bread of life. And the message of Christmas for you is that God did not serve up delicacies. His son is not an hors d'oeuvre or a dish cordon bleu. He's bread, as basic, as essential, as accessible as food can ever be, and as irreplaceable. He's the staple for all nations. And you are on the guest list, and you are invited to come hungry and to eat in an audacious way. And we have a demonstration of this in the Old Testament, where David and his soldiers were hungry. And they were out in a battle, and the only bread they could find were these 12 breads, the bread of faces, the bread of God's presence. And they were not supposed to eat it. It was only for the holy priest to eat in a holy place, but they were hungry, and they were desperate. And for the hungry and the desperate, there's an open invitation always to eat of this holy bread, because God has put in Jesus his own face on that bread, and that bread now is called Emmanuel, God with us. Eat it this Christmas in an audacious way. Don't wash your hands. Don't wait for the right day of the week. Don't fast right now, because he is with us. Let's pray. You are the Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace, and you feed our hunger of every kind, whether it is for help or comfort or guidance or just peace. Help us eat of you, bread of heaven, until we want no more.